Okay, let's go ahead and put a definition of climax community into our notes. Climax community is going to be defined as the final stage of succession, and this is the final stage of both types, okay? For primary and secondary are both going to end with a climax community. In this, the ecosystem will remain relatively unchanged until another disturbance. So the populations and the different types of species will remain relatively consistent unless something catastrophic would happen. Okay, let's talk about secondary succession. The biggest difference that you need to remember between primary and secondary succession is that when secondary succession begins, there is already a nice, healthy layer of soil on the ground. Okay, we just talked about with lichen how it's so important that they make the soil, and that process is so long and tedious. Well, because in secondary succession we already have this layer of soil, the process is going to go much, much more rapidly. Secondary succession can go from start to finish in a few hundred years compared to primary, which can take up to thousands of years. If you're wondering, what's the kind of the first step for secondary succession, how do we get to that first step? Secondary succession is always initiated by some sort of destructive or catastrophic event. Like a forest fire is a fairly common event, unfortunately, that leads to secondary succession. A hurricane, a flood, some sort of event that's going to drastically change the ecosystem, and it's going to wipe out a whole lot of species. Okay, like this forest fire that happened in Colorado or this large mudslide in Sierra Leone. Those are two examples of the beginning stages of secondary succession. And again, just emphasizing that key difference is a layer of soil remains behind after the destructive event. You forget how important soil is until, again, you don't have it anymore. Soil is what's going to support our producers, and we know, think of your energy pyramid, guys. The base of the pyramid supports everything above it, and our producers are always at the base. Okay, so here's a diagram just showing secondary succession. In this case, it was kicked off by a wildfire. One thing I do want to emphasize, other than the fact that it's faster and soil is already present, the other difference is lichen are not going to be our pioneer species. In this case, our pioneer species in secondary succession are typically going to be grasses or weeds or kind of wildflowers. After that, it's going to follow very similar stages to primary succession. We're going to get our shrubs, we're going to get our insects and primary consumers. Then we're going to start to get some trees. Typically, coniferous trees are going to come first, and our secondary consumers. And then eventually, we'll have nice mature hardwood trees, deciduous trees, and our climax community with many different levels of consumers. So here's one kind of case study of secondary succession. Bastrop is a county in Texas, and there was a huge, huge forest fire in 2011, so not that long ago, that was the most destructive fire in the history of Texas. It lasted 36 straight days of burning, and again, while it's burning, they're constantly trying to put it out. So this was a massive fire. It scorched about 96% of Bastrop State Park. So obviously, many, many species, tens of thousands of acres were just completely wiped out. And unfortunately, also were the homes of a large number of people. So this area really was greatly affected by this. The people living in that area, they said they kind of talk about their lives in two parts, before fire or after fire, because it really changed every aspect of their life. Now, the cause of this was not lightning, as is often the case with wildfires. It was actually caused by wind damaged power lines that were down and sparked 3 different fires. So in this case, I think they were getting the remains of a tropical storm was kind of passing through, so the high winds knocked down some power lines. Within 13 minutes of the fires igniting, the rangers were already issuing a mandatory evacuation, and as it grew, more and more people had to be evacuated. If you look at this picture and you didn't know it was out of context, you might just think these are clouds in the sky. This is a wall of clouds, a wall of smoke, and behind it is a wall of flames. So this was, again, trying to give you an idea of how big this fire was. Now, the fire, while extremely devastating, if there's any silver lining at all, one small benefit, I guess, is that ecologists now have an opportunity, probably for the first time, to study secondary succession in action, in a large-scale environment. Now, the process of succession, we said it's not going to be complete in their lifetime, so no ecologist is going to be able to observe it from start to finish, but we're already seeing the first few stages. New grasses have emerged, small wildflowers and insects are back, so that's a really good sign. And the climax community obviously is 100 plus years away, but it's moving in the right direction. The final ecological stage that will exist, we just said, is a climax community. Okay, let's do a little bit of succession Q&A. Okay, tell me which of the two types of succession happens in these pictures. First one, a volcano is erupting in the ocean. It's creating a new island. Would this be an example of primary or secondary succession? Hopefully you have guessed right that it is primary succession because the cooled lava will have no soil, and that's going to then be a good example of primary succession. Fires near Possum Kingdom Lake, primary or secondary? Well, we were just talking about the wildfire in Bastrop. Hopefully you guessed this is secondary succession. The path left behind a glacier, primary or secondary? So again, the process of a glacier melting we call glacial retreat, and that is going to be primary succession. It's just going to be rocks, and that's about it. Okay, another question. This is not primary, secondary, but I want you to tell me older to younger or younger to older. If you hike through a patch of land that contained a pine forest into an area that contained only ferns, shrubs, and grasses, would you be moving from a younger to an older community or an older to a younger community? Probably never thought about it, but now that you know all this stuff, you should be able to tell you're moving from an older to a younger community. Which community would support the greatest number and diversity of organisms? The pioneer community, one of the intermediate stages, or the climax community? Hopefully, when you think about it, you come to the conclusion that it's going to be the climax community. The climax community, our end stage, is very stable, and part of the reason it's stable is because there is a large amount of biodiversity there. What type of succession would take place if all the water from the pond evaporated and the pond went dry, primary or secondary? That would be an example of secondary succession. We already are going to have this sediment, which eventually will become soil as the pond dries up. Okay, here's what I'd like you to do. Instead of writing definitions for primary and secondary succession, we're going to make a nice little Venn diagram. Left is going to be primary, right is going to be secondary, and as you know with Venn diagrams, where they overlap, that's going to be whatever is true of both of them. Now, if you are someone who really doesn't like Venn diagrams, feel free to make maybe like a chart, okay, a table, and you can just list these things if that's more, appealing to you. The things that I want you to put are these statements A through J, okay? They're going to fit either under primary, under secondary, or in that overlap because it's true of both primary and secondary succession. I would highly encourage you to see if you could do this on your own. So if you want to pause the video now, that might be a good idea. I am going to reveal what you should have in your notes now. Okay, so primary succession, statements B, F, and H. No soil, no previous living organisms, and occurs after volcanic eruptions or glacial retreat. For secondary, we have statements C, E, G, and I. And so organisms currently are living there. We have the soil. It's the most common type of succession. Hopefully you guessed that. And it occurs after a hurricane or a wildfire. Lastly, the overlap area, what's true of both of them, they're both going to reach a climax community. They both have pioneer species. They're not going to be the same organisms, but they both have ones that are going to be the first to kind of colonize, and they're both going to be gradual change. Okay, take home points for today. Ecological succession, again, it's that natural process of the evolution of an ecosystem, follows that nice predictable pattern. The two types, primary where we have no soil, secondary where we do have soil. And please don't forget to complete your homework on limiting factors and carrying capacity. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.